In this video, I'm going to walk you through my resume. If we've never met before, my name is Vimal Bariali. I've been a business analyst since 2005. And as you can see from my resume, all of the experience that I have is listed across the 6 pages of the resume that I essentially have. And that goes against the very first tip that I see being given out to a lot of business analysts out there, which is to make sure that your resume is a maximum of 2 pages. I've heard this many, many times. This advice has been dished out to a lot of business analysts out there, and they are essentially forced to squeeze all of their experience down into 2 pages to try to communicate that to people. My experience on the job market has been very different because this 6-page resume that we're going to walk through today has helped me land countless business analyst roles, and it is triple the size of what the recommendation is for the resume size. The key point that you have to make sure your resume covers is that it passes the ATS. And so if you don't know what the ATS is, ATS stands for Application Tracking System. This is essentially the website of the company that you're applying to. When you upload your resume, that goes into the ATS, and before a human being even sees your resume, the ATS gets to decide whether your resume is good enough for an actual recruiter inside of that company to actually even see. If you don't pass the ATS, there's zero chance that you're getting into that job because your application has already been disqualified automatically by the system that you essentially submitted your resume into. Okay. Key number one is that it has to pass the ATS, and the way that you do that with the ATS is by making sure that your resume contains the keywords that the ATS is essentially looking for to match with the job description that you're applying for. Okay, and so we'll talk about that as I go through my resume. Second thing is that it has to be easy for a human being to read. So once it makes it past that first filter of the ATS, there is going to be an actual person that's going to be reading it. And that's part of the reason why many people say that it should be a max of 2 pages. But you don't have to live by that rule as long as your resume is easy for a person to scan and to understand. And so when I talk about the format of my resume and why I have it laid out in the way that I have with some hints and cues that helps a human being just kind of get a sense of what this vast resume looks like, those types of things can help make up for the fact that you don't have to have a 2-page resume, because it passes the ATS because you have a lot of real estate here to include all of your keywords. But number two is that when a human actually does look at it, it's easy for them to scan because you formatted it very well. All right. And so to overcome that advice there, again, hasn't worked for me for the last 20 years, and I continue to use my 6-page resume. You can choose to use whatever format you want, but hopefully this advice kind of gives you a different perspective than the advice that's out there for most people. Key point here is that you got to make sure that there's no fluff. All right. So this is especially true for business analysts who are, if you don't have as much experience to kind of build out a resume that is 6 pages long, you're going to feel compelled to make your resume a little bit longer by including stuff that doesn't really say anything, essentially. If you haven't done something, don't put it in there. If you can't talk about a line of your resume in an interview in a really meaningful way, it really has no business being there, regardless of what kind of advice is out there in the wild about what you should and should not be doing with your resume. Okay, so you follow those general guidelines, and your chances of essentially landing a business analyst role are going to increase dramatically. All right, so I'll give you a quick overview of my resume, and then I'm going to go reverse chronological through my experience section just to show you how I've kind of built out my career over the last 20 years. So as a senior business analyst, essentially, we just have a header section here. I make a quick summary of my experiences, and then I get straight into my experience. All right. Some resumes I've seen make the mistake of putting their education and everything else before their experience comes. Your experience is the thing that most employers care about the most. All right. So if you can do a summary of your experience, that's fine. If your career isn't long enough, I would say even just skip the summary and just go straight to the experience section as the first section of your resume. But if your career is longer, you probably want to give them a quick little bullet pointed list of the things that you've done over a long business analysis career. But make sure whatever you do, make sure your experience is the first thing that's out there. That experience essentially takes up the bulk of the resume. So I'm going to scan down all the way down to where my experience section ends here on page 5. And that's when I get into my formal education and the continuing education that I've done. Because the second most important thing your employers are going to be looking for is, hey, what kind of educational background does this person have? You want to kind of lay all of that out, that it's there right after they're finished scanning through your experience. These skills and the skills section here, I mean, I keep it in there because it allows me to jam pack a lot of keywords that I'm aiming for in there, but most people are probably going to skip that. Most humans that read this resume are probably not even going to try to line up with that, because by the time on a resume of this size, by the time they even kind of get halfway through, before they get halfway through the resume, they're automatically have made a decision on whether they're going to bring me in or not, right? Most cases, when they see that there is this much experience on a resume, they at least want to have a conversation with me, whether I'm the right person or not, because this amount of experience essentially gives a recruiter the sense that, hey, there's a high likelihood that this person can do this job really well. But as soon as they get into like my third or fourth different consulting engagement, or if they get into my full-time positions here, they've already decided, hey, so you know what, let's just bring this person in, or let's just do a quick phone screening to make sure that the person is not lying on their resume, or that they can actually have a proper conversation. Recruiters kind of, that's a recruiter's mindset, is that's how they're thinking. But what when you're doing your resume, again, if you have your experience in your education and then you can have everything else, don't keep it too fluffy, right? That no fluff rule here. This is a bit of a tough thing to try to stick to, because you're trying to essentially beat the ATS here with your keywords, right? But you're still trying to make it human readable, and you don't want to make it fluffy. And so it's easy for me to tell you, hey, don't make your resume fluffy. But in actuality, when you sit down to work on your resume, it's not as easy to strip out a lot of the stuff, because you want those keywords in your resume so that you make it through the first step, right? That you make it through the ATS in your job application. So 10,000 foot view, that's kind of what my resume looks like. Let's dive in, and I'll just quickly walk you through my business analysis career just by showing you the experiences that I've had. And I'm going to ask you to ignore this little typo that you see here. I did just notice that typo was there when I was preparing for this video, and on a resume of this size, I bet most recruiters don't even notice that the typo is there. But if your resume is a lot shorter, a typo like that is going to stand out massively, right, in comparison to the amount of experience you might be displaying. So you got to make sure, and again, I should be following my own advice here, and I am going to fix that as soon as I get off here, but you should make sure you proofread, double check your resume to make sure it doesn't have anything like this, because on a smaller experience set, something like that can seem like a major issue, right? By the time a recruiter gets down, I mean, I bet most recruiters that actually try to read my resume, I bet they don't even make it down to my first set of experiences here. So most of the recruiters that have seen my resume probably don't even know that typo's there, because by the time they've essentially got to this part of my resume or this part of my resume, they've already decided, hey, we're going to have a quick phone screening with this person to see whether they're a good fit. But you got to make sure that if your resume is not this deep, that especially if it's not this deep, you got to make sure you don't make those types of mistakes. That can be a major problem on your resume. Okay, so I started my career back in 2005 working for a government agency where I wasn't doing too many exciting things. I worked there for about 6 months, and as soon as I got the opportunity to jump in a full-time position in a much larger company that had a lot of projects, I took that opportunity. Okay, and so this page number 4 that you see here, this entire page is essentially full of projects that I did, right, for a company that built nuclear power plants, right? It was called the Atomic Energy of Canada. This company essentially built nuclear power plants all around the globe for different countries. to help them produce energy, and they had an endless amount of projects that needed to be executed. And so I was really happy to be able to get into a company like this because, as you can see, I essentially did 11 projects for them, finishing that my tenure there at that company with the implementation of what is called an asset management system that I helped them implement. But in total, I spent about 5 years there. So this 5 years plus the 6 months is about 5.5 years. The first 5.5 years of my career was just that. We can go through each of these projects in more detail in future videos, and I'll talk about them. But what I did after that point was that I'd realized that I'd kind of learned as much as I possibly could at this company, and I needed to just get into a completely different domain, completely different types of systems. I wanted something totally different. And so my next move was to essentially go into working for an insurance company. And I spent 2 years at this place helping them implement essentially a set of systems. It was a larger scale program. Essentially, what they were trying to do is they were trying to really kind of ramp up one of their lines of business, and they essentially just needed to completely reinvent that line of business from end to end. And so, kind of led that for about 2 years. And after those 2 years, I'd realized, hey, I think I'm ready to actually get into doing this type of work as an independent consultant instead of being a permanent employee. So after this point right here, I essentially took time off. I got myself incorporated and I started looking for contracts. And you'll see that after this point here, essentially, instead of being a permanent employee here, after this here, you're going to see all contracts, right? So did a short 6-week contract with the Insurance Institute of Canada. They needed, this was a bit of a tough one because I had to help them redesign 26 of their business processes within a very short period of time. Helped them execute on that. Then I took on a team lead role at a company that does benefits essentially. And so this company has is a service provider, but they essentially manage, they have a disability management platform that they resell to a lot of other companies, and they needed to completely rebuild that entire system. Large enterprise scale system. You can see here that I had 28 modules, and I essentially led the analysis team that did all of the business and systems analysis work for that project. Took a little bit of time off after that, and then I came back to that same place because they wanted me to help them extend that system with some workers' compensation functionality. So I did another year contract with that company. And then I essentially went back to the Insurance Institute again. And if you can recall from here, the Insurance Institute was the first contract I ever had here where I did a 6-week contract with them. They brought me back for another 9-month contract because they had a bunch of other projects that they needed to execute on. I had already built a reputation with them, and so they were happy to have me back. Then I completely switched gears again and I moved into the investment industry. This company right here is essentially a software provider for the mutual fund industry in Canada. And I helped them run a bunch of different projects essentially over a 6-month time period that I worked there. Then I got hired by the University of Toronto on a massive business transformation initiative, 2 projects actually. This very large one here is the one that took the majority of the 2.5 years that I was there. So we can talk about this one because this was a very difficult project. But again, tons of stakeholders, massive amounts of process design, and a lot of business architecture work, and then the implementation of a technical solution to kind of help support all of that, all of those processes. Then I went over to, again, switch gears again, went into a company that does, it's called the Ontario Power Generation. They essentially just generate energy. So they have a bunch of nuclear power plants, they have a bunch of coal power plants, and their job essentially is to produce energy for all of the province of Ontario in Canada, roughly about half of Canada's population, essentially. Just under half of Canada's population. So one of their biggest jobs is to essentially just produce a lot of energy, but I worked in their HR section here. So I essentially helped them build a business case for one of their projects and helped them do some data planning for one of their other projects. Then after that, what year are we in now? We're in the 2021, 2022. I went back to that same insurance company that I had worked at as a permanent employee. So if you recall, very, very early on, right after the atomic energy, I went to a company called Green Shield. Let me just kind of change my pen color here. I went to a company called Green Shield, right? And I worked there for 2 years as a permanent employee. Well, essentially 10 years later, they hired me again, but this time they hired me on a contract basis as a consultant. And I worked on 3 projects for them there over that 9-month contract. Then I went into another software company. These guys are kind of like a software, and they do a lot of business intelligence work around real estate, mostly around commercial real estate. But again, I worked mostly in their HR division. So I spent about 9 months helping them do a couple of different projects, essentially. All right. Currently, as I record this, I am working for another software company here, and I am again in the HR space, which kind of shows you, right, that I started off in government, then I went into the nuclear industry, then I went into insurance, then I went into, let's say, education, and then I went to mutual funds, and then back into insurance, and then into benefits. Like I've been kind of all over the place with my career, but if you look at the last couple of jobs that I've done, it's been centered very heavily around HR. And there is a bit of a reason for that is that once you start to build some capability in a certain domain, you're going to start to get a lot more job opportunities for that domain because the market sees you as having been specialized in that area, especially. So essentially, that's 10,000-foot view of my resume. Look, going back to our tips here, right? You can see that my resume is certainly not 2 pages long. My experience has been that you don't necessarily need to have a 2-page long resume. You just need to make sure that you are capable of passing the ATS with a lot of keywords, right? And again, if I go back to my resume, I can show you so many keywords that I have in my resume that essentially are meant to get the ATS to make me look like a good candidate so that a human being actually sees my resume. I've done all of these things too, so it's not like I'm just putting these in my resume because I want to try to game the system. I've done all of these things. I just need to make sure that I express them in the way that the ATS is going to understand. So keep your resume as long as you want. That's my advice. Make sure it passes the ATS, but once it does, make sure that your resume is not all janky and that when a person looks at my resume, right? When a human being tries to read my resume, I have made it very easy for them. I don't expect them to go in and start calculating how many years I worked on this job, right? I give them an approximation to say, hey, look, I did a 1-year contract here. I did a 9-month contract here. I did a 6-week contract here, right? And that's what they're scanning. They don't have to read all of the details, right? The recruiter doesn't have to read all of the details. That's up to the hiring manager and the rest of the people who are interviewing me. All the recruiter needs to see is hey, does this person have the level of experience that we have? What does the ATS say about whether this person's a good match? Yeah, you know what? I'm going to put this candidate forward to the hiring manager and see what the hiring manager says. Bam, my resume has now got me in interview, and I sit down in the interview and we essentially talk about my resume in a lot more depth at that point, essentially. So I've never had anybody complain in an interview that my resume is too long. Usually when I'm there in person, oftentimes they have a copy of it sitting in front of them, just going through, and they're asking me questions about specific experiences. When it comes time for me to ask them a question, I ask about, what do they need me to do so that we can actually start talking about their project right inside of the interview. We'll talk about that entire process later on, but hopefully just seeing a real business analyst resume gives you a sense of, number one, what your resume could possibly look like, but more importantly, what your career development might look like into the future. So what is your resume going to look like when you're 20 years deep into your business analysis profession? All right. And so hopefully it kind of gives you that context. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one.